What happens when a single father rents a room to a college girl with a secret? Ethan Cole taped the cardboard sign to the apartment door with trembling hands. "Room for rent," he wrote in a rush, letters pressed too hard into the cheap marker. The paper crinkled under his fingers. He folded a photograph of Hannah and slid it into the back pocket of his wallet the way he always did when he didn't want to look at it. Her smile was still soft in that photo, the light in her hair like a promise he never learned to keep. Mia was at the kitchen table, tongue poking between her teeth as she folded paper. Small white cranes lined the counter like a fleet waiting to take flight. She hummed, absent-minded and bright, oblivious to the envelopes stacked nearest the sink, each one with a glossy billing logo that made Ethan's chest tighten. The heater clicked and sighed. Outside, the city had the bored roar of late afternoon traffic. Inside, their apartment smelled like instant coffee and laundry soap. He'd taken the sign down the moment the paper fluttered in the breeze, but not before a man on the street had read it and given him a look that was half pity, half calculation. 2 paychecks left. Funeral costs still being paid in installments. The warehouse where he'd spent 12 years shutting its doors the same week Hannah wound up in the hospital. That's how the bills stacked, one loss making room for another. He'd been looking for someone who could cover rent and keep the place warm. He was not looking for a revolution. She moved in on the day the rain ran sideways. Anna carried a single canvas bag and a rolled sketch pad. She was small in a way that made her presence almost invisible. Quiet, careful, the kind of person who left no scuffs on door frames. Mia watched her with eyes that lit straight through Ethan's defenses. By supper, Mia had her on the floor, folding cranes and teaching her a finger trick that made the paper wings sharper. "You make them like this?" Mia asked, proud. Anna's laugh was low and private and made Mia's face crinkle. "No, you taught me." Ethan watched from the sink, hands in soapy water. He felt stupidly relieved. She seemed practical, no student loft clutter, no loud music, polite with her thanks, but there were little things that sat wrong in his gut and tugged. She never ordered takeout. Her clothes were simple but good quality, collars crisp, seams that someone paid for them. Once, when he came home early, he saw a sliver of silver on her wrist catching light as she bent over Mia's homework. A small bracelet, a stamped crest he couldn't immediately place. A tiny thing, a detail. It pressed at his mind like a pebble in a shoe. Days turned into the kind of routine that felt like an old sweater, comfortable in some places, worn thin in others. Anna helped Mia with math, teaching problems with an artist's patience. She left tiny folded cranes on Mia's pillow, paper wings whisper soft against the blanket. Ethan came home exhausted and found laughter in the living room like something both unexpected and necessary. He liked that she made dinner once a week, that she rewired Mia's mispronounced words into superheroes. He liked that she sat on the floor to read picture books with a small person who had seen too much grief for her years. He liked that when the apartment felt heavy, Anna would pick up a crane and, without a word, place it on the shelf above the stove. It was the way she moved her hands, deliberate but gentle, that soothed the scratch inside him. And still, the pebble lodged there. The following week, a credit card swiped at a cafe on the corner registered as a corporate account in the end-of-month subscription mail Ethan sifted through. He almost didn't notice until his thumb brushed the logo, Voss Holdings. He'd heard the name, the firm that had bought the industrial tract on the outskirts and shuttered the warehouses in the name of redevelopment. Voss had come up in layoffs, in gym from loading, and whispers on break tables about buyouts. It was a white-handed thing, tidy on the outside, expensive on the inside. Anna paid rent in cash, crisp hundreds, folded into sides that made Ethan think of envelopes from old films. It bothered him less because the money solved the immediate problem, and more because it did not fit the rest of her. Art students were usually broke, he'd always assumed. She was precise in ways that made him suspect there was a reason she could be neat with bills when she ought not to be. One night he woke to the sound of the laptop humming and a light under Mia's bedroom door. He padded down the hall. Anna was sitting at the little kitchen table, laptop open like a quiet altar. She had a small red USB in her fingers, the kind that had a protective cap like a nail polish cap. And she popped it in, watched the screen, fingers flying. She did not notice him, not at first. Then she looked up, startled, eyes large, and for a moment something like recognition passed through her face, and she closed the lid like a stolen thing. "Sorry," she whispered. Her voice had gone thin. "I'm sorry, I thought she was asleep." Ethan stood in the doorway, watching the red plastic between two fingers, the way she was careful not to let it touch anything. "You can use it," he said. "Just don't wake her." She hesitated 2 heartbeats too long. The bracelet on her wrist flashed in the lamplight. Ethan couldn't read the mark from where he stood, but he knew it was not ordinary. He had watched enough to be dangerous. He had stood in unemployment lines with men who had once believed in the land of hard work and now carried bitterness like an extra coat. He had learned how to look for what did not fit. "What do you do?" he asked, not wanting to seem nosy, but wanting an answer that wouldn't make his jaw drop. "Art," she said. "I'm an art student. I sell some pieces. I tutor when I can." She smiled, too quickly, the honest geometry of it collapsing into a practiced line. "I don't want to be trouble." "Okay." He left the room. He went back to bed with the red USB turning over and over in his head like a wheel. A week later, after she had shown Mia how to fold an origami butterfly, and after Ethan had watched the two of them paint cardboard planets for a school project, he found the bracelet in the trash. It was a small thing, as if she'd dumped it by accident. He didn't touch it at first. He lifted it with a paper towel. Engraved on the inside was a small, sharp emblem. A stylized raven, 2 wings folded like a code, and beneath, V.C. Ethan sat at the table and put the bracelet on the towel, as if he could keep evidence clean with paper. He could make assumptions. He could let the image of Richard Voss, immaculate CEO of Voss Holdings, fold into his mouth like a bitter coin. The rumors had been louder than the truth. But grief had taught Ethan not to trade facts for narratives. Hannah's death had been the rawest sort of lesson. He remembered her complaint of headaches, the doctor's shrug, the clean line on a lab report. He remembered flailing at officials who passed forms across desks like bridgestones. "No proof," they said. "We need proof." He remembered the funeral, the small casket, the minister's voice. He remembered the name of a water testing laboratory that had been stamped with language he couldn't read. He would not let his memory become a drama played at someone else's expense. If there were a connection, he wanted to be sure. The pebble in his shoe had become a stone. One night, with Mia asleep and the apartment hushed except for the heater's clank, he waited until Anna fell into a book. He took the laptop from the table while she napped on the couch, one small betrayal to expose a greater truth, and he slid the red USB into the empty port. Files stamped Project Raven Lake opened like a wound. There were documents labeled with internal dates, memos with blunt language, property values, mitigation cost analysis, stakeholder risk. There were spreadsheets of chemical dispersal calculations and a list of names, 17 lines, typed, with case numbers, dates, and in some instances short descriptors. At the bottom, a scanned personnel note. H. Cole, treated 0914, recommended no public disclosure. He leaned back and felt something cold and unaffordable slip out of him. He could have closed the laptop and put the files back and pretended ignorance. He could have turned them over to the police and let the system do its work, trusting it would. But the police in small towns were sometimes just as stretched as waiters during a holiday rush. He had learned how systems folded in on themselves. He had to decide what to do with a truth so heavy it felt like a physical object. Anna woke as he packed the red drive into his pocket. She watched him hold it, as if seeing a child for the first time. "You read it," she said. He didn't answer. The apartment seemed to narrow around the two of them. Mia's paper cranes cast small shadows. "You shouldn't have seen that," she said. Anna's voice was a thread. "You're Voss," he said. "Anna Voss." She looked at him then, whole and unguarded for the first time. Yes. He wanted to ask everything at once. Why would a Voss be hiding in his living room, paying him cash and teaching his daughter to fold cranes, like some quiet conspiracy? But those were ugly questions. He found his mouth saying something softer. "Why are you here?" She set her hands together, fingers worrying at the hem of the sleeve. "Because someone has to tell the truth." It was not a confession so much as a thread pulled taut. She told him in scraps, hesitant at first, then gathering steam like a runner picking up speed. Her father, Richard Voss, had run the company with the efficiency of someone who thought the world a spreadsheet. The company had bought land where old mills had stood, where neighborhoods smelt faintly of oil in the summer, and children had played in shallow streams. Voss Holdings took control of water rights, sublet maintenance to third parties, and optimized infrastructure to maximize investor return. When certain neighborhoods were declared at risk for floodplain issues, the company's analysts wrote internal memos about how lowering property values could be used to consolidate holdings. "Depressible assets," she said with a sharp intake of breath. She used the term as if tasting metal. She stopped, and the whole apartment became the small room she'd made with words. "They pushed contaminants into a feeder stream. They told maintenance to blame a faulty pipe, then paid to bury the reports. There was a memo about cost-benefit, more money spent on PR and local buyouts than on cleanup. They treated people like numbers. 17, she said, 17. Anna's hands shook. Her art-streaked fingers clutched the edge of the chair. "Hannah Cole is on that list," she said. "You told me about her. She came into the ER with symptoms that match. Liver failure, strange lesions. They called it unrelated. The notes, they flagged her as a collateral that needed managing." She swallowed. "I couldn't live with it." Ethan felt the floor move beneath him. The memory of the funeral, the small, perfect coffin, the minister's void-filling words rose like a smell. He thought of all the times he had been stopped by forms and red tape, told to wait, told to collect more proof. He had been a good husband, a competent father. He had not expected to become an investigator. He had been a man with hands only then learning the language of evidence. "How did you get this?" he asked. She looked away. For a moment he could see the world she'd left behind. White marble lobbies, men in suits with hands that never showed a callus. "My father thinks we're untouchable. I worked in a lab that interfaces with their projects. I saw the reports. I filed requests. They closed them. I saw the list. I took copies. I put it on this." She tapped the laptop as if it were a heart. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for help." He didn't know whether to be angrier at her for hiding it or grateful that she had brought the only thing powerful enough to change everything into a 2-story walk-up with loose floorboards and a stubborn heater. He chose to be practical. The next steps had to be careful. They had to be legal. They had to be witnessed. "We don't do anything stupid," he said. "No threats, no running. We document. We make sure the chain of custody is right. We get somebody official to take this." She laughed once, low and helpless. "Like who, Ethan? The police? You think they'll listen?" He thought of how he had watched a grainy video of a company's PR team at a town hall morph into a lesson in corporate self-preservation. "I'll call someone who can." They picked a time. They made lists. Ethan didn't tell Mia the whole truth. He told her that Anna had a secret she was brave enough to share, and that someday, when the world wasn't so loud, they would be proud. Mia embroidered courage into a paper crane and tucked it under her pillow like a talisman. The first sign of trouble arrived as a growl, a black SUV idling 2 blocks away, tinted glass catching streetlight like an eye. Anna froze at the sight. Once she had been the one with all the calm. Now she was a reed in a high wind. "He'll send someone," she said. "They track devices. They used a third-party network to triangulate my calls before. I turned the number off, but—" Ethan called the number he'd written on his hand. Agent Sarah Martinez, Federal. He had gotten the contact from a woman at a community center who worked with folks who fought environmental fraud. He did not expect an immediate answer. He expected voicemail and a return call in a business day. Instead, Martinez answered her phone with a clipped, professional tone and told him to pack everything, to keep things intact, and to come to a small meeting place, an old church basement that smelled of coffee and tradecraft. It took time, not because the world was lazy, but because the machinery of justice is a careful beast. FBI agents have to vet, to corroborate, to build cases that can survive in court. Martinez did so with a precise kindness that made Ethan feel he was a witness to a slow, meticulous sculpture. She did not promise speed, she promised diligence. Anna and Ethan handed the red USB over. They watched Agent Martinez unspool it, place it under a camera, run a quick hash, then a copy, then a sealed copy, then another. They watched the professionalism like a liturgy. They waited. They answered questions about chain of custody, about how Anna had obtained the files, about whether she had any family pressures, about her own willingness to testify. She said yes. In the weeks that followed, tension tightened like rope. Voss Holdings began to notice. It would be easy to imagine a corporate CEO hidden in a tower, signing off on things with clean hands. Richard Voss was not a cartoon. He walked into scenes like frost. His suits tailored the way men with power make the world fit them. He had motives that could be written into spreadsheets: property consolidation, investor returns, risk mitigation. He had a team of lawyers who were as careful with language as surgeons with scalpels. When men in suits inched around the neighborhood like slow thunder, Mrs. Chen, who owned the corner laundromat and had watched Ethan carry his daughter since he moved in, lifted her chin. Dave, the delivery driver who had once knocked on Ethan's door with pizza when he'd forgotten to pick one up for Mia's birthday, began parking his van where he could see both ends of the block. People who had once muttered about strangers started standing on stoops. Anna began to sleep in short bursts and wake with a small, hungry fear. She started sketching in the margins of her notebooks, the water lines, the town grid, small shapes like birds, ravens, that she drew and erased. She had not come to them looking for family. She had been a woman who had carved a path out of a gilded life because it hurt too much to be quiet. The cost of the truth had been exile, and exile had given her a hardness she wrapped around herself like armor. Ethan's conflict was a slow-moving earthquake. He had a sleeping child and a man that some in the neighborhood still whispered of in the past tense, a friend who'd lost everything and found bitterness in its place. He did not want to sacrifice Mia on the altar of retribution. He did not want to expose them to danger for a truth that would take months to produce consequences. He also knew what silence had cost him already. He knew the names on that list took people who would otherwise still be here, still folding cranes at kitchen tables. "This is bigger than us if we do it right," he told Anna. "If we do it wrong, it becomes a private war. We don't pick a fight with a corporation unless we can stand before someone who will listen." She nodded, not because she was defeated, but because she knew she'd chosen the only compass that made any sense. "I want them to know," she said. "I want people to know there were 17, and that their names aren't corners on a spreadsheet." She handed him the list. He read the names aloud, careful as if reading a prayer. Hannah Cole, Marcus Lane, Elena Torres, James Jimmy Ruiz, Rosa Delaney, Tyrone Matthews, Amira Haddad, Samuel Ortiz, Diane Bell, Luis Paredes, Karen Whitmore, Daniel Danny Cho, Nadia Flores, Robert Clancy, Maya Singh, Peter Harrow, Henry Cole, no relation, he corrected himself internally, though the name lodged like a mirror. 17 lives. each a small geography of mornings and teeth brushing, barbecues and neighborhood fights, graduations and bad haircuts. Names had weight again. They did not rush to the hallway in a burst of melodrama. The plan was measured. Gather witnesses, create a record that existed outside the control of a corporation with endless legal teams. Ethan knocked on doors. He made coffee. He told the neighbors, in language that did not press for courage but invited it, that something was happening that might require them to be seen. Mrs. Chen opened her door like it was ceremony. She had been polite while the neighborhood gossiped about who should move out. Her manner softened when Ethan explained Anna's story, when he said the word water and Hannah. She had a son who'd had a liver ailment a few years back. She knew the rumors. "I will stand," she said. She watered her geraniums in the morning light and told Ethan she had an old Nokia phone that was reliable. Dave, who delivered parts for a hardware shop and had the thick palms of someone who lifted more than he spoke, put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "If she's telling the truth, then she's brave," he said. He parked his van so it would be in frame for anyone on a roof or in a black SUV to think twice. "I got a dash cam." He laughed like a man who did not expect to need it for civic duty, but the laugh had gravity. Word spread not as a shout, but as a ripple. People who had been skeptical of a quiet art student found themselves moved by fragile evidence and by the way Mia's face lit when Anna sat on the floor. In an unremarkable hallway, people gathered with phones in hand. Some were curious. Some were angry. Some had their own quiet grievances with companies that made the rules. The day Richard Voss chose to come was marked by the sky that made the city look new, a hard winter sun catching in the chrome of his car as he stepped out. He had drivers, of course. He had a small legal team who arrived behind him with clipped passports and notes. He wore his power like a second skin. When he saw the apartment building full of anxious faces, his jaw tightened in a way that betrayed a man by nature in public control. Anna stood in the hallway with the red USB in her pocket and her shoulders squared. Ethan could feel the building breathing in around him. He had made a decision now that could not be reversed. This would be public, and therefore less controllable. "You're making a scene," Richard said first. His voice was low, the kind that could smooth the record of anything with one sentence. It was corporate persuasion translated to a man. Anna did not flinch. Her voice was steady, in the way of people who have held a truth until it behaves like a weapon. "You bought our streets and sold poison with your cost-benefit memos," she said. "You treated people like something to be optimized. My father—" She said the name because it had to be said. "Richard Voss, you and your company knowingly contaminated the water supply to lower property values. 17 people are dead. Hannah Cole is one of them." There was a rustle of phones. People shifted to make room. Mrs. Chen took off her cardigan and unfolded it like a flag. Dave raised his phone, its little red light catching like a beacon. Others did the same. Suddenly the hallway was an orchestra of recording devices, a makeshift court ready to testify. Richard's expression did what corporate training had taught him. It cooled. "You're a disturbed young woman spreading falsehoods," his lawyer said. "This is slander." Ethan stepped forward like a man without armor. He felt ridiculous and huge all at once. "We have evidence," he said. He made his voice solid. "We've turned it over to the authorities." It was not a soundbite. It was not televised. It was real, tactile. An attempt was made to separate and to intimidate. Richard's counsel offered hush money and polished envelopes, a smiling proposition that smelled of sanitized malice. They tried to take the USB out of Anna's pocket with a word and a smile, as if the physical act of taking the device might erase wrongdoing. Ethan put a hand on Anna's back. "We're not taking money," he said. He felt the resolve in his chest like a small stone. "We're not afraid." Phones were raised. Mrs. Chen recorded with her old Nokia, which hummed as if remembering its duty. A woman 3 doors down, the one who watered the plants with impatience every morning, put her phone down and said,
I saw the men from Voss at the council a month ago. They asked about buying my parcel. I said no. They said they'd reassess the area. My brother got sick." Her voice shook. People nodded. The corridor changed from place of gossip to a gallery of testimony. Richard's team tried to spin. They threatened legal action. They suggested that Anna had forged documents. They implied lawsuits. But the recordings had a rawness that bureaucratic words could not easily parry. A video of the exchange hit a neighbor's social feed within hours and then spread, the hallway itself becoming evidence, the faces of neighbors shining like witness marks. Voss's first move was to count influence and feel the floor shift. Public opinion, ephemeral and unpredictable, had a way of sanding down the smooth edges of corporate impunity. They called lawyers, PR teams, and made statements. They also called their private security, men who had been trained to unmake messes. A man reached for Anna's arm. Ethan did not move physically to strike him. He moved with the older, slower language of defense. He put his phone between man and girl, filming, positioning his shoulders so the line of sight on the corridor kept everything visible. "Hands off," he said. It was not a threat. It was a command. The security man hesitated, then withdrew, because in that moment the corridor had become a public place. Phones had turned into instruments of accountability. The presence of witnesses limited a private sea of power. It was not heroic. It was strategy.
Anna's strategy had been to make her father's power public, and the neighborhood had responded with an almost instinctive sense that protection had a new form: community documentation. The video made its way to national channels and to local advocacy groups. The matter moved from conversation to investigation. Agent Sarah Martinez arrived the next morning with bags and printed subpoenas and a calm competence that forced the legal machine into motion. She did not promise a miracle. She said, "We'll need to verify everything. We'll need lab tests, forensic imaging, chain of custody, interviews. It will take time." It took time. Months are boring and miraculous at the same time. Martinez put a protocol in place. The USB was imaged, then handed to labs. Independent environmental scientists visited the harbor of the feeder stream and took samples. There were emails and memos and a web of internal communications that, once pulled, made an ugly tapestry. Voss Holdings had a paper trail. There were memos about market adjustment, an internal note recommending liability control above remediation, and an attachment that referenced Project Raven Lake as a cost-effective solution for rezoning. Anna sat in a witness chair and answered questions that made her face pale. She had misgivings and guilt. She had stolen data, true. She had also chosen a kind of exile because of it. Martinez's team worked with a U.S. attorney who discussed terms. Anna's cooperation was vital. The government offered protective measures and a prosecutorial path that would focus on the corporate leadership. In exchange for complete cooperation and testimony, Anna was offered limited leniency for the theft of proprietary data. A legal bartering, human in its imperfection, but honest in the sense that prosecutors often bargain to get the biggest fish. Ethan watched through the slow months as evidence congealed into a case. Not everything was clear. Some files were redacted. Some witnesses were reluctant. Voss's defense used every procedural move it could. But the lab results were damning. Concentrations of contaminants far above regulatory levels. Maintenance logs falsified. A string of internal memos where money calculations were placed above human cost. The word deliberate moved from rumor to finding. Public hearings followed. The courtroom was a place where language became law. The prosecutor painted a picture of decisions weighted against neighborhoods. Voss's lawyers painted another, an argument of corporate complexity, of third-party contractors, of plausible deniability. Wealth buys a kind of contortion in truth. The trial was not instantaneous. It did not make suffering vanish. It did not erase Hannah, but it did create a record. It did place Richard Voss at the center of a web where he had to answer. On the witness stand, Anna's voice did not tremble as much as it did the first day. There were moments when she swayed, looked at the jurors, and saw faces that might have included the mother of a child she'd once sat next to on a bus. She told them what she'd seen, how she had taken copies because she could not swallow a silence that would keep names in a ledger like dust. Ethan sat in the public chair, feeling older, his hands knotted like string. He listened to his daughter tell details of the morning Hannah had been taken. The words were careful and terrible. The jurors reached a verdict in the way human beings do when confronted with a prosecution that rests on data, on witness testimony, on the odd, inevitable moral gravity of facts. Richard Voss was convicted of willful contamination, conspiracy to conceal environmental hazards, and a series of counts tied to obstruction. The sentence was not a fairy tale. There were appeals. There were lawyers with polished cuffs. But the conviction meant accountability of a legal kind. There was money, arranged in a way that attempted to repair: settlements, trust funds, remediation budgets. Voss Holdings was compelled to fund cleanup, to invest in community health initiatives, to open records. A restitution fund was created that covered medical costs, counseling, and a promise to rebuild. Ethan signed forms with trepidation. Money would never fix a person who had been lost, but it could give Mia the peace of a year without counting bills, the freedom to eat non-instant meals for a while, the ability to sleep without making lists. Anna's coming into the Cole home did not create a perfect ending. There were legal consequences for her actions. She had broken laws to do what she believed was right. The government's negotiation gave her protection and a path forward that did not erase her guilt. She took job offers with environmental nonprofits eager for someone who had seen corporate mechanics from the inside. She learned how to answer questions without flinching. She learned to let Mia call her Anna, not the person who saved us, though that label sometimes slipped into the mouth of reporters and made her feel simultaneously proud and painfully conspicuous. The neighborhood's suspicion, which had simmered into grudging respect, turned into a steady warmth. Mrs. Chen left a small wooden key hanging in the doorway of the apartment building, a little ornament the size of a thumb, carved from scrapwood. "For new doors," she said, pressing it into Ethan's palm. He kept the key in a drawer with the old rental receipts that proved for him, always, the right to a modest life. He taped a small crane beside it. There was an official ceremony, small and cautious. The city council, under pressure, voted to fund a clean water initiative, an oversight committee for industrial projects, and a fund to survey the aging water lines that run under neighborhoods like worn arteries. A plaque was erected at a small park near the rehabilitated stream. It was not a cure. It was a public admission, a civic acknowledgement that some lives had been worn thin by human choices. Anna began to call their apartment home. Mia, who never quite learned the language of residual grief, treated her like a friend who had simply always been there. Ethan watched the two of them on quiet mornings, making breakfast like the world was simple. He taught Anna how to fix a squeaky heater with a can of oil he kept under the sink. She taught him how to fold a swan without creasing the wings. There was an official legal moment that bounded them. With the coalition's consent, and in a small courthouse room, Anna signed papers that made the name Cole hers in a practical, legal way. Adult adoption, an old, solemn ritual for the newly chosen, was possible in their state. She pressed the pen with hands that had once pressed only on paper memos for a father who had not slowed enough to see his errors. She chose the name because she wanted to make a home where kindness stuck like a patch. It was not a cure for every wound. There were tremors. Anna sometimes woke in the night, and Ethan found her at the kitchen table, hands pressed to her face. Sometimes journalists circled like gulls. Sometimes angry former investors wrote op-eds about due process and private property. But life, in its slow stubbornness, grew around them.
They restructured the old budget, used part of the restitution fund to enroll Mia in a summer program that meant she could see the ocean without bringing anxiety in a tide. Hannah's name lived in small things. A paper crane framed above the table, folded with the same hands that Mia had once crimped into wings. A wooden key saved like a relic. A rental receipt mounted in a small shadow box that said something about the quiet legality of home. Ethan kept a photograph of Hannah on the mantel, not as a constant ache, but as part of the furniture, present, integrated into their story. The found family they became was not fanciful. It was uneven. It was weekday mornings, burnt toast, and art auctions where Anna sold small sketches and donated the proceeds to a community health fund. It was Mia teaching Anna how to make a paper crane with the tail tip folded just so, and Anna teaching Mia how to shade a sky with charcoal so stars looked real. There were hard conversations. Anna admitted late one night that she had once considered returning to the life she'd left, going back to a home that had money and a name. "Sometimes I think he'd have never let me alone if I stayed," she told Ethan, voice brittle. "But then I think of those memos and the clean hands with the numbers. I couldn't sleep with that." Ethan put his hand on hers. "You made a choice," he said gently. "That doesn't mean you don't have to pay for it. It means you have to live with what you did. We'll live with you." The months of legal motion translated into a new routine at the Cole apartment.
Anna found a job cataloging environmental data for a nonprofit. She took night classes in public policy. She volunteered at the town clinic that had once told Hannah to come back if things got worse. People that once avoided the Chet's Corner table now stopped and asked how Mia's origami class was going. Dave brought over a used ladder and fixed the antenna on the roof so their TV didn't skip when the wind shifted. The public narrative, once a roar, quieted to a steady murmur. Richard Voss served his time, a fact that did not erase the dead or the injured, but did carry a kind of civic punctuation. His name continued to appear in business pages, through lawyers' appeals and press releases, but he was no longer the man whose decisions slipped into neighborhoods without consequence. Ethan signed forms to accept restitution for Hannah, for funeral costs, for therapy. He used the money not as an antiseptic but as infrastructure, to pay off the last loan on the apartment, to enroll Mia in extra classes, to buy a battered upright piano that someone on the next block was giving away because their kids had left home. He had never loved the instrument before, but he now loved its ability to make the apartment sound like a place where music could reassemble a life. Anna kept the red USB in a small envelope and gave it to Agent Martinez with a solemn, ceremonial care toward the end of the trial. Martinez placed it in evidence, and it was photographed and documented like a holy relic. Ethan kept a copy of the original files on a backup drive in his sock drawer, not to keep secrets, but to keep the truth accessible, as if memories required redundancy. There were small local traditions that took shape from the breakthrough. Every spring, the city cleared the old stream, and strangers from neighborhoods that had once been pitted against one another came with gloves and grabbers to pull junk from the water. The Clean Water Initiative installed signs and educational kiosks that taught children how to test water and pour samples into little lab kits. They taught young people a language their elders had not been given, how to look after infrastructure and hold it to account. At the apartment, on the mantel, the crane and the wooden key lived among frames and small objects that were ordinary and extraordinary by equal measure. One rainy afternoon, Mia asked Ethan to tie a string around the key. "So it doesn't get lost," she said, with the solemnness of a child who had learned the weight of small things. "You make sure it's secure?" Ethan asked. She nodded and tied the knot tight, "So someone else can find it." Years later, the scene that once played in the corridor was taught in small civic classes as an example of community accountability, how neighbors showing up and recording a moment can help tip the scales. It was a lesson, not a romance. It was about strategy. It was about the humdrum of courage.
Some of those students came back to the park and read plaques, and the plaque mentioned names, not just of officials, but of people like Hannah, whose lives now had a material place in a city that had once let infrastructure whisper without oversight. The legal world kept turning: appeals, settlements, audits. The Clean Water Initiative was not a panacea, it was a beginning. The trial had forced Voss Holdings to restructure part of its board and to fund a permanent oversight fund. Public policy changed in small increments. People who had been harmed got counseling and medical funding. There was no fairy tale payout that replaced loss with a grin. Instead, there was a steady, practical rebuilding that changed how business and community interacted. Anna stayed. There were nights when she would stare at the framed rental receipt in their hall and think of the day she had first knocked on Ethan's door, her bag light, a bag of secrets heavy. She saw the old bracelet sometimes, polished and placed in a little box at the back of a drawer. She would open it and turn the metal over to remember the choice she'd made. Ethan learned to be less protective in some ways and more deliberate in others. He had been a man who had lived by simplicity and who had then been thrust into a kind of complexity that refused to let him be small. He had also discovered the resilience of a community and the possibility that ordinary choices could result in extraordinary consequences. There was a small ceremony they did not speak about. One afternoon, when the air had turned the color of late summer, with window shade dusted like snow. Mia brought a paper crane to the park where the plaque now stood. They found a bench and she placed her crane next to the plaque. Ethan took her hand and squeezed. Anna was beside them, the three of them like a small island of imperfect happiness. "Do you miss her?" Mia asked, the question that had the weight of years and the innocence of a child. Ethan looked at the plaque and then at the crane. "Every day," he said, "but she's here, she's in this." Anna folded her hands. "She's in us," she said. They left a wooden key hung on the bench rail, a ritual that had begun in a doorway and moved into the street, a symbol passed from hand to hand. It was not legal language, it was not a policy, it was a promise, to keep doors open and to keep the small things that made a home available to those who needed them. Years later, when the news cycle had moved on and new scandals filled headlines, people still came to the park to sit by the water. The stream sparkled because someone had cleaned it, because the city now funded tests, because students had learned to treat evidence like something fragile and necessary. Anna's name appeared in a list of speakers at a community symposium. Ethan taught a class on small home maintenance at the community college. Mia grew into an adolescent who wrote essays on public health and took a particular interest in origami, which she said was her way of keeping hope folded into neat shapes. There was never a moment when the past felt wholly resolved. Grief is not a story that closes like a book. But the arc of their life had moved from survival to building. The found family that emerged, three people made legal and spiritual by shared suffering and brave choices, did not erase Hannah. It honored her. It taught the city that when ordinary people act with courage and when a secret is brought into the light by someone who chooses the cost of disclosure over comfort, structures can be held to account. At the end of another ordinary day, Ethan found himself taking the train into the city to meet Agent Martinez and Anna for coffee. They talked without cameras or witnesses. There were fewer sharp edges to their conversation now. Martinez had left federal service and joined an NGO that specialized in environmental accountability, a move that made Anna proud and the city safer. Anna, who once had a name that came with a fortune, had chosen the simplicity of a life made honest by work and by repair. On the table sat a small framed photograph of Hannah, soft smile, hair catching light like a lighthouse. Ethan picked up the paper crane they'd bought at a fundraiser. It had a small wooden key tied to it. He thought about the night he'd taped the room for rent sign and the improbable chain of events that had unspooled from that small act. People asked them the question that started it all, as if it were a moral puzzle. What happens when a single father rents a room to a college girl with a secret? What happened was slow and legal and messy and human. What happened was that a secret became evidence, that neighbors showed up and kept their phones held like torches, that the machinery of justice, imperfect and deliberate, grounded a corporate wrongdoing in accountability. What happened was that a girl who had been born into wealth chose exile because she could no longer bear the price of silence. What happened was that a city learned to test its water and to teach its children how to be witnesses. What happened was a found family rose from the rubble of grief. Mia ran ahead, as she always did, paper wings cutting the quiet. Ethan and Anna fell into step behind her, two adults who had rebuilt a life with small tools, paper, patience, paperwork, and with the odd courage of people who chose to do the right thing, even when it was costly. The wooden key swung in Ethan's pocket like a metronome marking the steady beat of ordinary bravery. If you had been there the first day Anna walked in, you might not have guessed that the small, quiet art student would pull a thread that unraveled a decades-old scheme. You might have seen the sign on the door and discounted it. You might have crossed the street. Or you might have stopped to knock and said, "Are you sure you want to do this?"
And then stayed. If this story touches you, if you imagine yourself in Ethan's shoes, or wonder what you would do with a piece of truth that could change a town, leave a note. Tell us what moment mattered most to you. The origami cranes, the red USB, the hallway full of phones, or the quiet adoption that made a name into home. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people making extraordinary decisions, and tell us which moment in this story moved you the most.